You're listening to our Arsenal for Democracy Summer 2019 podcast spinoff, Lend-Lease. This is episode 5. We're recording on July 7th. I'm joined this week, as usual, by Nate. Hello, Nate.
Hey.
And by Rachel in Idaho. Hi, Rachel. Welcome back.
Hi, Bill. Hi, Nate.
So we obviously have got in this country a little bit of a renaissance of the American left and some socialists and so forth. Contrary to some of the rumors out on the street, this is not a socialist radio program or podcast, but we certainly like to look at the history of, labor movements, syndicalists, anarchists, socialists, and that sort of thing. This week, we're going to be talking about municipal socialists. Obviously, we've touched on it here and there on past episodes, but we were going to take a little bit of a deeper dive. We've got socialism now with its sort of highest popularity in the sort of post-World War I or World War II at least period in this country right now. I think I saw the Fox News headlines expressing terror and revulsion at a Gallup poll showing 40% of Americans didn't have a problem with socialism, which largely I think reflects age demographics in the post-Cold War period. But we wanted to start, we're going to go around to various different parts of the United States, but let's start at the beginning with America's first socialist elected mayor in 1898, John C. Chase, who was the socialist mayor of Haverhill, Massachusetts, not too far from where we are here. And there was a great Boston Globe article last month, which my mom pointed out to me, and this had some interesting history on that, so I was going to read a bit of that. Socialism has long evoked pushback in America. Socialism warned a much earlier coalition of Republican and Democratic Party leaders is un-American, embraces doctrines, quote, imported from foreign countries, end quote, and threatens traditional marriage, organized religion, and other basic American values. Those comments weren't made on Fox News last week, but rather in 1898 in my hometown of Haverhill, after it made former shoe worker and union activist John C. Chase the nation's first elected socialist mayor. Haverhill also elected socialist city councilors and aldermen and sent 2 socialists to the state house. I didn't learn about this local history while attending Haverhill Public School decades ago, and even now few Bay Staters know that socialist candidates also fared well in Holyoke, Amesbury, Brockton, Georgetown, Chicopee, and elsewhere more than a century before Burlington, Vermont felt the mayoral burn, so to speak. Now, Brockton, I want to mention, that was one that was subsequently became a real hotbed of really pretty far left activists, like I think Bolsheviks and anarchists and stuff like that around the time of World War II and the Russian Revolution. So right now, today, it's more of a kind of reactionary, low turnout, working class town. A lot of Republican votes coming out of there, I think. But we're talking about a different era. And the author actually highlights sort of the Massachusetts-specific connection that contributed to a lot of this. The views of Debs, Chase, Carey, and other American socialists were shaped less by Karl Marx and more by Chicopee Falls native Edward Bellamy, author of Looking Backward, the best-selling 1888 novel that envisioned a utopian socialist America in the year 2000. And all of it came true. No. Chase balanced ideology with practicality in his 1899 inaugural address as mayor. As mayor, he would support the principles of socialism, he said, but only insofar as they may be applicable to a municipality. His focus was progressive and decidedly good government, an 8-hour workday and better wages for city workers, more honest, transparent contracting, public works jobs for the unemployed, lower gas prices and public parks, clean streets, and other services and benefits generally taken for granted today. Socialists who were ideological purists dismissed this as gas and water socialism, which we'll talk about later, but gas and water won elections, ideology did not. However, and this is another key theme of today's episode, electoral success proved short-lived as establishment parties regrouped and stoked fears that socialist proposals such as the 8-hour workday, however mainstream they now seem, threatened fiscal and social ruin. Like voters now, voters in 1898 probably did not know really what socialism meant. Subsequently, Charles Coulter was also a prominent elected official in Brockton, as I mentioned, Brockton being a left-wing working-class community at the time. But this was, in John C. Chase's case in Haverhill, that was the first socialist mayor elected in the United States. One of the challenges is that every time a socialist would get elected, at the time, most municipalities had very short terms. So, instead of a mayor in many places having a 4-year term, it was common in a lot of parts of the United States in the early 20th century and late 19th century to have 1 or 2-year terms. So somebody like John C. Chase would be lucky to stay there for 2 years before getting kind of coalitioned out of office. So we looked up some of the other socialist municipal governments, and we're going to talk about some of them. Obviously, we know that Burlington, Vermont, had Bernie Sanders for a long time, but there's actually been quite a few Burlington socialists subsequent to Bernie who were elected mayor. And another great sort of example of this coalition problem was that John C. Menton was elected mayor of Flint, Michigan, and he served for 1 term as mayor before the Democrats, the Republicans, and General Motors organized a unity ticket to oust him. A literal co-founder of GM, Charles Stewart Mott, was the person that was chosen to replace him as mayor, and did so. And obviously, there's also one current mayor at the moment who's a socialist, Chokwe Antar Lumumba, the mayor of Jackson, Mississippi. His father, so the current mayor, he's a millennial. His father was briefly the mayor, who was this pretty well-known black separatist figure, arguing that the black population of the United States should have its own separate institutions and government and so forth. But his son, taking a more sort of standard municipal socialist approach, was recently elected mayor. We've also got, and we'll have all the links up at arsenalfordemocracy.com. There were some great resources of like searchable maps and charts, so you can see kind of the trend lines overall. 1911 was the peak year of elected officials. That was when many of these officials were elected, I think including Menton, if I remember correctly, in Flint, Michigan. And there were 65 mayors elected who were socialists. There were over 100 other elected officials, could be aldermen, city councilors, county clerks, things like that. And Ohio overall has had more socialist elected officials than any other state. But the interesting thing is that peak dues-paying membership for all socialist parties in the United States was 1912. There were 113,000 members, and I think that a lot of that probably had to do with the previous year's success of getting all these socialists elected. Unfortunately, when you have a bipartisan coalition running candidates against them the next time to make sure that doesn't happen again, that tends to discourage people from continuing to sign up. So sort of the double-edged sword of electoralism, right? You can rally a bunch of people to join and get involved, but if it falls apart after that and you can't sustain it, it's going to be a lot more difficult. So something to, obviously keep in mind and try to figure out what your plan for that is so you don't dissipate all the energy. Now, in Rachel's state of Idaho, 1 in every 200 residents was a dues-paying socialist in 1912, the peak year nationally, and that was a very one of the higher proportional ones. Obviously, a lot of the Mountain West states didn't have a lot of people in them, so proportion wasn't that hard to reach. New York State had the highest absolute number with nearly 10,000 members, and there were about as many members in Texas as in Wisconsin, roughly 4,600 members. Which I thought was an interesting fact. Now, Rachel, do you want to talk a little bit about this guy from Idaho, the sole socialist mayor from the state of Idaho, before we move on to talking more in depth about Wisconsin?
Yeah, so in 1911, that peak year of socialist mayors and other municipal officials, Coeur d'Alene in northern Idaho had a mayor named John Travers Wood. He just served for 1 2-year term. We've talked about Idaho history in the past. Coeur d'Alene was near mines, so it probably had that pro-labor populism going on, and that's what led him to get elected. In the post-war years, in the 1950s, I believe, he became a 1-term right-wing congressman from that got sent to Washington, and something odd that he espoused was he mistrusted the United Nations, citing its charter's similarities to the Soviet Union's constitution, and he mentioned as much to the U.S. Flag Committee. So he obviously did a 180 in his later years. He took office at age 72. It's kind of interesting how much he changed in those like post-war years. That was kind of an interesting blip in Idaho history there.
Yeah, and obviously, we've talked about this before. One of the big sort of impediments to the socialist movement and really kind of helped choke it off as it was potentially about to take off, although obviously, as we've just shown, there was a peak in 1912 before World War I, and the socialist revolutions and so forth that were happening in various countries triggered the first Red Scare, like really significant crackdown in the United States, and that certainly did a lot to damage the movement. And this guy was elected, as you said, one term for mayor in the pre-World War I era, then goes and serves in World War I, and then later in his 70s in 1950 is extremely narrowly elected by just a matter of a few hundred votes or so. In 1950, serves for 2 years, then is defeated by the same candidate by a similarly narrow margin in 1952. But yeah, like you said, somehow turns into this extremely reactionary right-wing, anti-Soviet, etc., which a lot of American socialists distanced themselves from the Soviet Union and had a lot of, qualms about Stalin and so forth, which makes sense. But, there were different people reacted differently to that. A lot of them just said, well, that's not what I believe. That's not my version of socialism, and moved on from there. But this, as you said, did a 180 here. Obviously, we need to talk about Milwaukee, as I just alluded to. This was one of the higher population ones. Obviously, like New York and Illinois had, greater numbers, but Wisconsin had those 4,600 dues-paying members in their peak year. Texas having the same, but not having necessarily the same success with this municipal socialism. And Nate, of course, your family has such strong ties to Wisconsin and Milwaukee. So let's talk about that. Nate, what do we need to know, Nate, about socialism in Milwaukee?
Right. Well, they had a series of socialist mayors lasting up until 1960. So you sort of think about how interesting it was during the whole 50s Red Scare and McCarthy and all that coming out of Milwaukee. But they also had Frank Zeitler as the mayor of Milwaukee, but they had a series of mayors, Emil Seidel, Dan Hone, and then Zeitler. And as you mentioned, my grandfather, I guess, moved to Milwaukee like the year after Zeitler left office, and is sort of like a liberal Republican, was sort of begrudgingly forced to admit the nice things the socialists had done to the city, and had the respect for them in that sense. But we can talk a little bit about sort of the whole sewer socialism that we talked a little bit about before with the whole gas and light thing. Another thing actually I wanted to quickly mention about the Haverhill was the 1895, the shoe strike there, dubbed the Crusade of the Women by a local paper, and this sort of reflects the upsurge of labor activism in that period. There was a depression between 1893, 1897, and that led to sort of these, the Pullman strike, and that was all in that milieu. But going back to Milwaukee, there's a couple articles we pulled up, Milwaukee Independent, talking about how people have sort of forgotten in many ways, like the history of all of this. And but at the time, it was pretty. So following Seidel's election in 1910, socialist organizer is an other city turned Milwaukee into a verb signifying successful socialist reform. A man running for mayor in Oklahoma, for example, spoke of Milwaukeeizing Oklahoma City, and it became kind of a mecca for socialists like Carl Sandburg, for whom Sandburg Hall is named. And then you had a long-running mayor, Daniel Hone, but he was the longest-running mayor. And then, but I guess a large part of this, had to do with a very sort of image of good government, I would say. Whereas, and they make contrasts in here, or like compared to some of these like more party-dominated, machine-dominated East Coast cities where people have pretty much given up the hope that the government will in any way be reflective of their concerns. There was sort of a spirit that persists to this day in Milwaukee where it was like, okay, well, our views will actually get heard, and it's somewhat more responsive. So public works are a prime focus, and there's a lot of stuff that was done in terms of the park system that persists to this day. So there's the lakefront parks and all sorts of sort of very German style open. It was various beer gardens and things like that. But in addition, they created the nation's first state worker compensation system all the way back in 1911, as well as the first unemployment compensation law in 1932. They were working on various types of public housing, including the garden homes completed in 1923, with the first instance of municipal public housing in the United States. There were various public health campaigns, including vaccination and postnatal care. And so, but up until, so this was obviously, controversy over the treatment of people of color and various civil rights issues within the socialist movement, before the quote unquote civil rights era. But under Zeitler, I think sort of the pro-civil rights policies were picked up, whereas they had been sort of ignored before. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of history of this. You have these interesting pictures where you have the goddess Milwaukee sitting above the building, and the workers are all clamoring towards her, and she's gesturing towards socialism in the distance. And it sort of speaks to a very American conception of socialism. And you sort of think Milwaukee is in many respects like the middle of the country, and it has a lot of diversity in it as well. And they talked about the some of this tradition going back to the German immigrants who came over after the 1848 attempted revolutions. And then another article sort of contrasts the socialists to the the Progressive Party, which is also very influential in Milwaukee and was sort of a Scandinavian and rural base of support, as opposed to the Germanic urban worker support. So,
although they did cooperate in coalitions frequently,
so they did, and they explained how they would work together and have coalitions. Yeah. So, but yeah, no. So I mean, I guess the main things that comes out of these Milwaukee socialists is the whole sewer socialism, and at this point in America, there was a lot of just dumping of sewage in rivers, and we didn't quite have the public infrastructure that we have now. So that became a huge priority for these various administrators, and that people saw that the sewage was not going in the river anymore. So I mean, even if you weren't necessarily inclined to certain aspects of Marxism or whatever you thought socialism was, you could at least think like, oh, at least they're trying to look out for my best interests. And so there you go. And there was also talk about whether they wanted to nationalize the Milwaukee Electric Railway and Light Co. And it was apparently never done, but people thought that the fact that they were pushing towards nationalizing it several times, maybe that had an effect on it could have been more exploitative otherwise.
So, yeah, obviously, Frank Zeidler was the last one. He was the third socialist mayor, but he was the last one. But he's kind of a really interesting figure. I mean, Nate, you just mentioned a number of the ways in which he was, and especially the fact that he was the post-war one, right? He was 1948 to 1960 was the time that he served.
Yeah.
And so, he's this really interesting figure. When he was 21 years old, he gave this interview, which is quoted on the Wikipedia page, which I thought was interesting, explaining why, ideologically what he, liked about socialism. He said, one was the brotherhood of people all over the world. Another was its struggle for peace. Another was its equal distribution of economic goods. Another was the idea of cooperation. And a fifth, which seems probably the most relevant for his later career, was the idea of democratic planning in order to achieve your goals. Those were pretty good ideas, he said. Now, he, said that he was not supportive of Soviet communism, and he was active in the Lutheran Church, as you're alluding to. A lot this like German urban tradition in Milwaukee was very influential on this, and he saw this socialism as fulfilling his religious convictions. Now, he originally was elected, to various county level offices in coalition with the Progressives. When he was quite young, and when he was 28, he was the nominee for governor of Wisconsin. But his older brother, in 1940 was elected mayor of Milwaukee, and this potentially could have been a very significant turning point against socialism because his brother was not, as far as I'm aware, a socialist, and maybe didn't share some of those views or whatever. But his older brother defeated Dan Hone, which, as Nate said, was the longest serving one who had been there for, I think, several decades. And so that could have been the end of socialism in Milwaukee. But then in 1942, after Pearl Harbor, he, like a number of elected officials, for some reason decided that instead of serving on the home front as an elected official, he should volunteer to serve in the war. So he went and joined the Navy, and his ship got sunk. And that was the end of that. And so, there was an interim mayor, and then that guy got elected for, an additional term, but then there was an open seat after that. And so Frank Zeidler runs in like a 14-way race, but everyone in Milwaukee knows who his brother is because he's the former mayor who, died heroically in World War II. And so he gets elected mayor as an openly socialist candidate, and proceeds to, continue the socialist agenda, and as you said, bring in some of these more progressive elements, civil rights elements, things like that. The other thing is that he was very pro annexation, which, if people aren't familiar with what that's all about, basically in the United States there's a long history, and this is also true in some other places in the world, but it's very controversial in the United States, of major cities gradually annexing the neighboring suburbs around them. And a lot of the people in those suburbs really don't like that. Now, this is particularly very controversial history in Boston, and eventually some of the annexations were stopped there, and this ended up leading to a trend of a lot of suburbs blocking annexations. And especially in the post-war period, as we're starting to see the, GI suburbs going in, and we're starting to see the white flight happening, there was a real potential tipping point again where Milwaukee could have gone in a very different direction and seen, this sort of hollowing out from the white flight. And Zeidler's response to this was just to very aggressively steamroll through everyone and say, we're going to annex you no matter what. And for the most part, he was successful in that. So the population of Milwaukee municipality actually remained static rather than declining, as all these other cities were beginning to experience because of this. And he had this interesting quote that he gave, which I thought was very funny, in 1958, which was toward the end of his, I think this was in his probably final term. He said, quote, "The city consults with suburban governments, but we do not believe they have reason for existing." And of course, the sort of downside to the annexation, or the flip side to it, is a problem that we've seen in other places that have done more annexations, and particularly in Canada, in Toronto. This has been a huge thing, which is that if you annex a bunch of reactionary white suburbs around this more diverse working class urban core, you can sometimes end up with the surrounding suburbs having so much political sway that they can control politics, which I think is subsequently what happened in Milwaukee, especially in the much more recent era. We had this area that was this multiracial working class hub, a lot of black Wisconsin residents there, various immigrant populations, etc. And gradually you see Milwaukee's politics shifting and the county's politics shifting and so forth, and leading to this coup d'etat, essentially, where Republicans are able to take over the state, and, Scott Walker and the Republican legislators are able to pass all these sweeping reforms to entrench their power. So it's another sort of tough trade-off there, but, something to keep in mind. Other comments? Rachel, did you want to talk about any of the Milwaukee stuff as well?
I just wanted to note that after leaving office, Zeidler was instrumental in reforming the Socialist Party USA in 1973 and served as its national chair for many years. And I think that's pretty awesome, because you can see how he kind of preserved this little nugget of socialism in America and kind of kept the flames alive until today, when we kind of get that resurgence of favorability for socialism in America.
The last thing that I think we wanted to talk about this week was just very briefly about the current surge of elected socialists in Chicago. There was a Guardian article by Micah Utrecht, I think,
This Guardian article is from this past April. 3 Democratic Socialists of America, or DSA members, won their city council races in 2019 runoff elections on Tuesday. Byron Sigcho Lopez in the 25th Ward, Jeanette Taylor in the 20th, and Andre Vasquez in the 40th. The fourth candidate, Rosanna Rodriguez Sanchez, is locked in a race in the 33rd Ward that is too close to call. She subsequently won and was sworn in. They will join 2 other socialists who handily won the first round of elections outright in February, Carlos Rosa, an incumbent in the 35th Ward, and Daniel Laspada, who defeated an incumbent in the 1st Ward. Add them up, and you've got 6 Democratic Socialists who will be on the 50-member Chicago City Council. Few major American cities have seen even a single socialist councilor in generations. The 3rd largest city in the U.S. could soon have half a dozen. It's the largest socialist electoral victory in modern American history.
Yeah, so sort of an interesting thing. And then the other thing that I was thinking about as I was reading about these election results in Chicago and then looking over some of the data from that University of Nebraska, University of Washington resources and study on the trends in various states over time. I was thinking about the fact that we've got this Mayor Pete guy running from Indiana for president. Indiana had a fair number of socialists as well. None from South Bend, as far as I was able to find. But yeah, it's interesting that he is, instead of being part of this wave of municipal socialism.
Well, his dad was.
That's true. That's the other thing, ironically,
so he's
here.
rebelling by being a neolib.
Yeah, his dad being this Marxist scholar and so forth. Is that Mayor Pete is going and calling up the literal billionaire donors and saying, oh, it's not an us versus them. I'm not going to be like that. Please give me money for my presidential candidacy. And they seem to be lapping that up, which is just wild to me. I mean, it's so stupid. It is us versus them. There are no billionaires that are on my side. I mean, come on. So, this refusal to identify an enemy is just, there are enemies. If you don't identify the ones that are the actual enemies, then people are going to identify people that shouldn't be identified as enemies as such. That's kind of, I see it as that way. Closing thoughts from either of you on any of this?
I did want to point out that Chicago was the teachers union there. It was kind of the inspiration for a lot of the teacher strikes, including in LA. So there is a pretty strong coalition of workers coming together in Chicago and building power. So that's pretty impressive.
One other thing in terms of these types of election results, there was the DA's race in Queens. I don't know if Tiffany Caban is explicitly saying that she's socialist or whatever, but there was some shady stuff going down with where she initially seemed like she had won and defeated the Democratic
and then
backed candidate, and then
some
all
ballots
of a sudden
materialized, and all of a sudden there was a
provisional ballots,
less than 100 vote lead for the establishment candidate, and then they tried to throw out the provisional ballots. Yeah,
and this is
Great
still part
stuff.
of the Joe Crowley machine that are just extremely mad that AOC won, and everyone's mad at AOC, including Pelosi today, apparently. So, yeah, it's all part of the same. I mean, the point is that these machines, I guess, won't really roll over, and they sort of have to be actively combated. So,
right, because I mean, that's the thing that one of the themes of today's episode is you can elect people all over the country in 1911, and by 1912 or 13, they're all going to be gone because they didn't combat not only did they not combat the machine of one party, is that all the machines linked up together and General Motors for some reason to defeat them. And so you have to have a bigger plan than just winning a single election. Because I don't think this show has an anti-electoral stance. Obviously, I'm running for city council right now, so there's not an anti-electoralism stance on this show, but you have to have more of a plan than just one election, I think, in order to, do more than that. And that's sort of one of the lessons that I guess from a place like Milwaukee, right, is that they were able to be in there for literally decades, because they were able to somehow consolidate a power base.
Yeah, and gain the trust of people that even weren't necessarily socialists, but just thought that, hey, these people are looking out for us and the city is running okay and there are nice parks and stuff. So, I mean, I think that sometimes we get caught up maybe a little bit too much in various terminologies or ideologies or whatever, and a lot of people just sort of have base responses to the things that they actually need getting done. So, something to think about. I don't know.
All right, gang, that's it from us for today, because we had a real long episode last week, and I don't want to hear the criticism that the episodes are getting longer and longer each week. That was an unusual case. So we will wrap it up here. Again, the links, as always, will be at arsenalfordemocracy.com, so you can see the various notes on today and get the links to the different charts and data and things that we were talking about today. Rachel, thanks for being on the line today.
Thanks, Bill.
And Nate, thanks for being here as well.
Thanks, Bill.